What is a maid doing with my father's violin? The Langford kitchen was not a place for music. At midnight, it belonged to silence and shadows, to the hum of the refrigerator and the sigh of pipes in the walls. The great house slept above, its tall windows shuttered, its corridors empty of the polite chatter and polished footsteps that filled them by day. Only one lamp hung over the long wooden table, throwing a pool of gold light across the grain. Everything beyond that circle dissolved into darkness. And in that circle sat Eliza. She was barely 20, too young for the calluses on her hands, too young for the weariness that bowed her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. Her hair had slipped from its neat knot. A strand clung to her cheek. Her maid's uniform, once stiff and clean, was marked with the day's work. Flour at the cuff, soap water stains at the hem. By every measure, she should have been upstairs in the cramped attic where the staff slept. But she was here, bent over something no maid had any right to touch, a violin. It was an old thing, nearly broken. The varnish had dulled to a reddish shadow. A fine crack ran across the top plate like a scar that had tried to heal. One string was missing. Another hung loose. The bridge leaned at a dangerous angle. Its bow lay beside it, hair yellowed and splayed. Anyone else might have tossed it into the trash. But Eliza touched it as though it were alive. She had found it by accident hours earlier, while storing a box of napkin rings in the pantry cabinet. The violin case had been shoved behind old tableware, its leather peeling, its brass latches nearly rusted shut. She should have left it. She knew better than anyone the boundaries of a house like this. But when her fingers brushed the case, something inside her chest stirred, a memory without words, like the faintest echo of a song. So when her chores were done, when the floor gleamed and the bins were emptied, she returned for it. She laid a towel on the table, set the violin down gently, and began to work. She was not a trained luthier, only the daughter of a seamstress who could mend anything with patience. She knew about broken things, clothes, toys, sometimes even people. And she knew that some things, if you gave them attention, would remember how to live. With no proper tools, she improvised. A bent paper clip to nudge the bridge, a pencil stub to mark alignment, a dab of petroleum jelly to coax the stubborn pegs. And from her apron pocket, wrapped in tissue, one E-string she had carried for months like a talisman, hoping one day it would meet an instrument. At last she raised the bow. It creaked in her hand, stiff with neglect. She rosined it clumsily, shook off the dust and set it to the strings. The first sound was a harsh squeak. She winced, tried again. A note rang out, thin but true. Another followed. She tuned carefully, head bent, listening not to perfection but to the way the sound pulled against her memory. And then she began to play. She had no sheet music. She had never owned any. But she carried inside her something stronger than notes on paper. From stolen moments listening outside church doors, from old records played in a neighbor's house, from the stubborn persistence of her own heart, she remembered. Mozart. The melody rose tentative, then steadier, clear as a river finding its course. Her bow hand trembled, her eyes closed. The notes filled the kitchen, soft at first, then opening like wings. The refrigerator's hum blended into the harmony. The tick of the clock fell into rhythm. The house, so long empty of music, seemed to lean toward the sound. Far down the corridor, Alexandra Langford stopped walking. She had just left her father's study with a file of contracts under her arm. The papers were heavy with legal language. Property details, numbers she had memorized without seeing. She lived among numbers now, and silence. Since her father's death 3 years earlier, she had built a life of order, one that did not allow for stray notes or unexpected grief. She had forbidden music in the house. She had locked the violin away herself. And yet here it was. The sound arrested her. It cut through her like glass. She knew the melody instantly. Mozart. The same piece her father had played every Sunday afternoon. When the windows glowed with sun and she, a child, sat cross-legged on the rug and pretended she could follow the score. He would pause mid-phrase, smile, and say, "Listen, Lex." The second phrase feels like coming home. Her knees nearly buckled. The music carried her back without permission, to his laugh, to the warmth of his hand, to the day he put down the bow forever. She had avoided this piece for years, and yet hearing it now, raw and imperfect, she could not turn away. She followed the sound to the kitchen door, her anger rising as defense. A maid, she thought. A servant daring to touch what belonged to her father. She would put a stop to it immediately. But when she opened the door, her words froze. In the circle of light sat Eliza, eyes closed, bow trembling, playing as though she belonged nowhere else. Her cheap uniform could not disguise the grace in her posture, the reverence in her hands. The battered violin seemed to glow, transformed by being touched again. "Stop," Alexandra said. The music fell away. The last note lingered, fragile, then dissolved into silence. Eliza's eyes flew open. She lowered the bow, her face blanching. "I'm sorry, miss. I thought no one would hear. I'll put it away." But Alexandra did not move. She could not. The sound still reverberated inside her, reopening wounds she had buried under paperwork and distance. The tears came hot and sudden. She turned her face aside. But it was too late. "That piece," she whispered. "My father played it. For me." Eliza clutched the violin against her chest. "Then it remembers him," she said softly. The words pierced Alexandra more deeply than any apology could. For a moment, the gulf between heiress and maid, marble and mop, seemed to vanish. All that remained was music and grief and the strange mercy of being understood. Alexandra let the papers slide from her arm onto the table. She sank into a chair, head bowed. She should have been furious, should have demanded the violin return to its case. But instead she whispered, almost pleading, "Play the second phrase, the part that feels like coming home." Eliza hesitated, then lifted the bow again. The note rose, trembling but true. And as the phrase unfolded, Alexandra wept openly, not just for the father she had lost, but for the truth she had kept locked away. Truth that, like the violin, had only needed someone brave enough to play it again. That had been the rule, spoken by Alexandra Langford herself on her first day as mistress of the estate. Servants were to remain invisible, as they had in her father's time. Their job was to sweep, polish, cook, disappear. They were not meant to be seen, much less heard. And certainly not meant to pull music from the silence like a ghost resurrected. But now Alexandra sat at her own kitchen table, cheeks damp, while a maid held her father's violin and played notes that reopened every room of her childhood. The contradiction was unbearable. She wanted to stand, to slam the case shut, to lock it away again. Yet she stayed, listening. When Eliza let the last phrase fade, she lowered the bow with trembling hands. Her gaze flickered to the floor as if she expected punishment. Silence pressed in again, heavy and awkward. "You should not be here," Alexandra said at last. Her tone was brittle, too sharp to hide the tremor beneath. "No, miss," Eliza murmured. She set the violin carefully on the towel, as though laying a body down. "It was wrong of me." Alexandra pushed back her chair. She should have left, but instead her hand reached toward the violin. Her fingers brushed the wood and recoiled, as if burned. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "No one taught me," Eliza whispered. I only listened. Alexandra's brows knit. Listened? Eliza's eyes lifted, timid but steady. I used to clean outside the music rooms at church. The door was cracked, so I listened. Sometimes I sat on the stairwell after choir practice, and once I carried water for a man who taught lessons in the town hall basement. He let me hold his bow. That was enough. Alexandra stared at her. Enough for Mozart? Eliza looked down again. Enough to begin. For a moment, Alexandra felt the absurd impulse to laugh. Yet she couldn't. Because beneath Eliza's humility, the truth was undeniable. The girl could play. Imperfectly, yes, but with an intuition Alexandra herself, despite years of childhood lessons, had never possessed. The heiress rose abruptly. Put it away. Eliza obeyed, lowering the violin into its case. Her hands lingered on the edges, unwilling to close the lid. Finally, she snapped it shut, the sound like a coffin sealed. Leave it there, Alexandra said, surprising herself again. I'll decide what to do with it. Eliza nodded, stepping back as though retreating from forbidden ground. Alexandra gathered her papers from the table, though she no longer cared about them. She left the kitchen without another word, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the sleeping house. The next morning, the house was bright and orderly again. Staff moved in practiced silence. The case still sat on the kitchen counter, drawing Alexandra's eyes like a wound. At breakfast, her Aunt Margaret, who had come to manage social appearances since Edmund's death, commented on Alexandra's tired eyes. You're working too late again, she scolded gently. I slept fine, Alexandra lied. Margaret buttered her toast with surgical precision. Then don't let the staff keep you up. They've been known to overstep, you know. Best to keep them reminded of their place. Alexandra's chest tightened. She remembered Eliza's words. Then it remembers him. A maid had said that, not a tutor, not a guest. A maid. And somehow it had been the truest thing Alexandra had heard in years. She excused herself quickly, leaving her aunt to her tea. That evening, Alexandra returned to the kitchen deliberately. She half expected the violin to be gone, returned to its dusty exile. But there it remained, and Eliza, wiping counters, froze when their eyes met. Alexandra gestured. Play something. Eliza blinked. Miss? You heard me. Timidly, Eliza lifted the violin from its case. She hesitated. I don't know many pieces. Then play what you know. And she did. This time it wasn't Mozart, but a folk melody, simple and unadorned, one Alexandra had never heard before. It sounded of fields and dirt roads, of evenings when windows were lit not by chandeliers, but by lanterns. The tone was rougher, the rhythm uneven. Yet Alexandra felt her throat tighten all the same. Halfway through, the door opened. Margaret stood in the doorway, lips pursed. What on earth? Her eyes narrowed at the sight of Eliza holding the violin. Is this a joke? Alexandra, why is the maid playing in your kitchen? Eliza lowered the bow at once, horror flooding her face. I'm sorry. But Alexandra cut across her. I asked her to. Margaret's brows shot up. You asked? Good heavens, Alex. Staff are not entertainers. This is highly inappropriate. She plays well, Alexandra said coolly. Better than I expected. That's hardly the point. Appearances matter. What would people say if they knew you were indulging servants in this way? Alexandra's voice hardened. They would say nothing, because they won't know. This is my house. The two women stared at each other. Margaret affronted. Alexandra unflinching for once. Finally, Margaret sniffed. Suit yourself. But don't come crying when boundaries blur and respect dissolves. she swept out, skirts whispering like condemnation. Eliza stood frozen, cheeks pale. "Miss, I should go." "No," Alexandra said sharply, then softer. "Stay. Play the rest." And Eliza did. That night, after the last note faded, Alexandra surprised herself again. She asked, "What was that piece?" "A song my mother used to hum," Eliza said. "I don't know its name." Alexandra hesitated. "Play it again tomorrow." "Yes, miss." As Alexandra left the kitchen, she realized something she hadn't admitted aloud. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. That warning had come from Aunt Margaret the morning after she discovered Eliza with the violin. She spoke it over tea, her voice trembling with indignation, as though Alexandra's request to hear music in her own kitchen were an act of treason. "Staff are staff," Margaret pressed. "Once you let them think their place is higher, they will forget themselves. And if society hears about this, heaven forbid, it will not be the maid who bears the shame. It will be you." Alexandra stirred her tea with measured calm, though her pulse throbbed. She did not argue. She did not confess that she had sat in the kitchen again last night, listening to Eliza play the nameless lullaby until the house itself seemed to breathe differently. She merely inclined her head and said, "I'll handle it." But the words did not mean what Margaret thought. That evening, Alexandra returned once more to the kitchen. Eliza was there, polishing cutlery. The violin waited in its case on the counter. "Play," Alexandra ordered, as she had before. This time Eliza hesitated longer. Her hands trembled as she opened the case. "Miss, I don't want to cause trouble." "You caused no trouble," Alexandra said sharply. "Only music." Eliza's eyes flickered with doubt, but she obeyed. She lifted the violin and began to play a simple etude, the kind designed for practice, yet in her hands it sounded alive, as though she were speaking in a language Alexandra had forgotten she knew. The heiress sat, listening with arms folded, pretending the music was nothing to her. But when the final note faded, she whispered, almost against her will, "Again." 2 weeks passed this way. Night after night, Alexandra found excuses to wander into the kitchen. And each night Eliza played, sometimes Mozart, sometimes scraps of folk songs, sometimes only scales that still managed to feel like prayers. The staff began to notice the pattern. They did not speak of it aloud, but whispers traveled the servants' hall. The mistress spending her evenings in the kitchen, the maid who had found favor. And though Alexandra ignored the stares, she felt the tension gather like static in the air. It broke one evening when the cook, Mrs. Hargreaves, burst into the kitchen unexpectedly. Eliza had just finished a delicate passage when the door swung open. She froze, bow in hand. Mrs. Hargreaves gasped. "What on earth? Girl, put that down before you scratch it." Eliza nearly dropped the instrument. She plays at my request," Alexandra cut in, rising. The cook blinked in shock. "At your... Miss Langford, forgive me, but this is not proper. That violin belonged to your father. It shouldn't be handled by... By whom?" Alexandra's voice sliced through the room like glass. "By hands that work? By someone born without a title? My father would have disagreed." The cook faltered, her face red. "Of course, miss. I didn't mean... Then leave us." Mrs. Hargreaves backed out quickly, muttering apologies. When the door shut, Eliza lowered the violin, shaking. "Miss, this is wrong. People are talking. If they think I've..." "They will think what they wish," Alexandra snapped, though her chest was tight. "Let them whisper. I am not afraid." But she was. Not for herself. For Eliza. A week later, the danger grew sharper. The Langford estate hosted a small gathering. Trustees, family, friends, A few musicians from the city hired to provide background music in the parlor. Alexandra moved among the guests with her usual poise, but her mind was restless. She had not seen Eliza all evening. Halfway through the night, she heard it, a violin. At first she assumed it was the hired quartet, but the tone, raw, searching, achingly human, was unmistakable. Her heart lurched. She followed the sound down the hall and stopped dead. There, in the corner of the service corridor, stood Eliza. Alone, unaware of being overheard, she played the same nameless lullaby she had played in the kitchen. The notes drifted like smoke into the corridor, fragile yet defiant. And not far away, two trustees lingered, listening. Alexandra's breath caught. If they saw, if they realized... "Eliza!" Her voice rang sharper than she intended. The girl startled, bow slipping. "Miss, I didn't mean—" "Put it away." Alexandra strode forward, taking the violin from her hands with more force than necessary. "This is not the time." The trustees exchanged curious glances but said nothing, retreating to the parlor. When they were gone, Alexandra turned on Eliza. "What were you thinking? If anyone realized—" Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't thinking. I just needed to play. I thought no one could hear." Alexandra softened, guilt piercing her. She handed back the violin gently. "You don't understand the risk." "If society learns the Langford Maid plays this instrument, they'll sneer. At me, yes, but worse, at you. They will call you thief, imposter, liar. They will not see your gift. Only the scandal." Eliza nodded, swallowing hard. "Then I'll stop." But as Alexandra looked into her trembling hands, she knew she could not bear that silence. "No," she whispered. "Not stop. Only careful. Promise me you'll play only when I ask. Promise me you'll let me protect you." Eliza's eyes widened, then softened. "I promise." And though the promise was spoken, both of them felt the truth. Music, once awakened, could never truly be hidden again. Servants don't sit where scholars gather. Not in this house. Not in any house with a name worth keeping. The words were Aunt Margaret's, whispered sharply as she straightened Alexandra's collar before the guests arrived. Tonight, the Langford estate was hosting a salon, something her father had loved. Music, conversation, a handful of intellectuals gathered under chandeliers. Alexandra had revived it out of duty, not desire. She had no taste for performance anymore. And yet, as the carriages rattled up the drive, she found herself wondering, absurdly, what would happen if Eliza were allowed inside the room with her violin. It was unthinkable. Margaret's voice echoed, "Not in this house." And yet Alexandra could not silence the memory of the lullaby in the kitchen, nor the tears it had pulled from her against her will. The evening began smoothly. The quartet tuned in the corner, their polished bows slicing the air with professional ease. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, gowns swished across polished marble. Alexandra moved among them, smiling where she must, nodding at remarks about her father's legacy. Eliza was nowhere in sight. She had been ordered to remain in the back hall, tending trays. Alexandra told herself this was for the best. Still, her eyes strayed toward the service door more than once. Halfway through the night, fate forced the issue. One of the hired musicians snapped a string mid-performance. The piece ground to an awkward halt. Murmurs rippled through the room. The first violinist rose, embarrassed, explaining they had no spare string. It would take time to fetch one from town. Margaret leaned toward Alexandra with a hiss. "This is humiliating. End the evening before gossip takes root. But before Alexandra could respond, the service door creaked. Eliza stepped hesitantly into the room, violin in hand. A ripple of shock passed through the guests. Whispers rose instantly. The maid? With an instrument? Margaret's face drained of color. "Get her out!" she whispered furiously. But Eliza's eyes sought Alexandra's, silently pleading. And Alexandra, against every rule, every warning, every instinct to preserve dignity, gave the smallest nod. Eliza raised the violin. Her hands shook as she tuned quickly by ear, ignoring the quartet's glares. Then, before anyone could stop her, she began to play. At first it was tentative, but within moments the melody bloomed, filling the parlor with a warmth that silenced every whisper. It was not flawless, it was not polished, but it was alive. Every note carried breath, memory, defiance. For the first time in years, the Langford house sounded like itself. The spell broke abruptly. One of the trustees, a sharp-featured man named Harrington, stood. "This is outrageous," he barked. "A servant parading as a musician in the Langford parlor?" Gasps followed. Margaret rushed to support him. "You see, Alexandra? This is exactly what I warned you of." Eliza froze mid-phrase, bow suspended. Color drained from her face. She lowered the violin, already stepping back toward the door. But Alexandra's voice cut through the noise. "She plays because I asked her to." The room stilled. Every eye turned to the heiress. Alexandra's heart pounded, but her chin lifted. "My father believed music belonged to anyone with ears to hear it. I will not see his house silenced because a maid dares to play." Harrington sneered. "You shame his memory. This girl shouldn't even be in the room." Eliza's bow slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. The sound rang louder than any applause or protest. She snatched it up, trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I'll go." She turned to flee, but Alexandra's hand caught her wrist. The guests watched, scandalized, as mistress and maid stood bound together in the center of the parlor. "You'll stay," Alexandra said firmly. The evening ended in uproar. Some guests departed early, muttering about impropriety. Margaret scolded openly, warning Alexandra she was ruining the family's standing. But Alexandra stood her ground, even as her insides churned with fear and defiance in equal measure. When the last carriage rolled away, silence descended again. Only Eliza remained, standing at the edge of the room, violin clutched like contraband. "I've ruined everything," she whispered. Alexandra shook her head. "No, you reminded them that music is meant to be heard, not locked away." Eliza's eyes glistened. "But they hate me for it." "Then let them," Alexandra said quietly. "I will not." And in that fragile, forbidden moment, heiress and maid stood together, knowing the world outside would not forgive them, but also knowing the music had already crossed a line that could never be erased. Whispers always travel faster than truth. The morning after the Langford salon, servants carried gossip into town with baskets of bread and errands at the post office. By noon, shopkeepers repeated it between customers. By dusk, the story had twisted into something else. The Langford maid had taken her mistress's violin and performed before the trustees as if she were born to the stage. Eliza knew nothing of this at first. She rose before dawn, as always, to polish brass and sweep staircases. But she noticed the way other staff avoided her eyes, the way conversation hushed when she entered a room. In the scullery, a footman muttered, "That's her, the one who thinks she's better than us." She bent her head, cheeks burning. Upstairs, Alexandra faced the storm directly. Aunt Margaret sat in the study with a newspaper spread before her. "It's begun," she said grimly. "Listen." She read aloud an editorial from a society column. "One wonders what will become of the Langford estate when servants are invited to masquerade as artists. What next? Will cooks direct the orchestra? Will footmen claim a place among scholars?" The words struck Alexandra like blows. But Margaret's next words struck harder. "This is not about her, Alexandra. It is about you, your name, your father's memory. People will say you've lost all sense of propriety." Alexandra stared out the window. "They say it because they fear her gift." "They say it," Margaret snapped, "because you let a maid stand where she never belonged." Downstairs, Eliza sought refuge in work. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She polished silver until her hands stung. But nothing silenced the memory of last night. The guests' stares, Harrington's sneer, the weight of Alexandra's hand on her wrist holding her in the room when she would have fled. That evening, Alexandra entered the kitchen. The violin case sat untouched on the counter. Eliza shook her head. "I shouldn't play anymore. It's caused too much harm." "Music isn't harm," Alexandra said softly. "It is when people hate me for it." Alexandra opened the case, laid the violin gently in Eliza's hands. "Play for me, only me. Let the rest of the world gnash their teeth. They cannot erase what I have heard." Eliza hesitated, then raised the bow. The first note trembled, but soon the melody found her again. Alexandra closed her eyes, and for a moment the world outside the kitchen walls ceased to exist. But the world did not stay outside for long. A week later, Alexandra received a letter sealed with Harrington's crest. Its words were blunt. "If you persist in parading a servant as a musician, the trustees will withdraw their support. The Langford legacy will be remembered as a house of scandal." Margaret waved the letter triumphantly. "Do you see? They mean it! End this nonsense before the estate loses everything!" Alexandra set the letter down, her hands steady though her chest burned. "They want to erase her. They want to pretend the music never happened." "They want to protect what remains of our dignity," Margaret retorted. "No," Alexandra said firmly. "They want silence, and I will not oblige them." That night, Eliza found Alexandra staring at the violin. "You should let me leave," Eliza whispered. "If I go, the rumors will die." Alexandra looked up sharply. "And where would you go? Back to scrubbing floors in some town where no one listens? To a life where your music is buried alive?" Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. "At least you would be free of this shame." But Alexandra shook her head. "Do you not see? It is not shame. It is fear. They fear you because you prove what they deny, that genius can bloom in dust, that beauty does not bow to bloodlines. If you vanish, they win." Eliza's lips parted, but no words came. She only clutched the violin tighter, as if it might vanish too. The backlash reached its peak 3 days later. A printed handbill circulated through town. "Langford Maid masquerades as musician, household in disgrace." Someone had even sketched a crude caricature of a servant girl sawing at a violin while wealthy guests jeered. The paper spread like wildfire. Copies landed on shop counters, pinned to tavern walls, tucked into church pews. One copy found its way back to the estate, left on the gate by an anonymous hand. A footman brought it inside. Margaret nearly fainted with fury. Alexandra read it in silence, jaw clenched. Then she carried it into the kitchen and laid it before Eliza. The girl's face went white. Her fingers trembled over the drawing. "They hate me." "They fear you," Alexandra corrected. "So they turn fear into laughter." "I can't bear it," Eliza whispered. "Everywhere I go, I'll be the maid who thought she could be more." Alexandra's eyes burned. She reached across the table, resting her hand on Eliza's. Then be more. Let them choke on their paper. They can't erase the truth, not if you keep playing. That night, Alexandra did something reckless. She carried the caricature into her father's old study. She laid it beside his portrait, the one where he stood with the violin tucked under his chin. You told me once, she murmured to the painted face, that music belongs to anyone who listens hard enough. If that was true, then help me now, because the world wants me to silence her father, and I don't think I can. The painted eyes, kind and steady, offered no reply. But somewhere in the house, faint and trembling, Eliza's bow drew across strings in the kitchen. The notes floated up the stairwell like a fragile defiance, and Alexandra knew. The paper could smear ink, could twist stories, could even shame her name. But it could not kill the music that had already been set free. The demand came from Trustee Harrington himself, delivered in a cold, clipped voice inside the drawing room where Alexandra once sat as a child with her father. Now the room was a battlefield. Harrington and two other trustees stood in dark coats, their eyes sharp as blades. Aunt Margaret hovered at Alexandra's side, nodding as if to punctuate every word. She's a maid, Harrington went on, a servant who has crossed lines that should never be crossed. You let her play in your parlor, Alexandra, and now the entire town mocks you for it. Our name, your father's legacy, is dragged into tavern jokes. You must dismiss her immediately, quietly, before this becomes irreparable. Alexandra sat rigid, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles burned. No, Margaret gasped. Alexandra! She is not a thief, Alexandra continued. She did not steal that music. It was already in her. To dismiss her would be to deny what I know to be true. Harrington's lips curled. Truth. Do you think society cares for truth? They care for decorum, for boundaries. If you do not remove her, we will remove our support. The estate will crumble without us. Alexandra rose slowly, spine straight as her father's once was. Then let it crumble. I will not erase her. The trustees exchanged scandalized looks. Harrington muttered, Then she will be erased without your permission. Downstairs, Eliza sensed the tension without hearing the words. The servants' corridor had grown colder these days. Conversations hushed when she entered. One chambermaid spat under her breath. She thinks she's someone now. The cook, once kindly, now handed her trays without meeting her eyes. Every kindness had turned brittle. Every hallway, hostile. She clung to the violin as her only anchor. At night, in the kitchen, she played in whispers, scales so soft they were almost prayers. Alexandra came when she could, sitting silently at the table, listening. But even there, fear crept in. Miss, Eliza whispered one night, lowering the bow. They want me gone, don't they? Alexandra's silence was answer enough. The breaking point came during Sunday service. Alexandra rarely attended the local church, but Margaret insisted this week, eager to display contrition before the congregation. The pews filled with murmuring townsfolk, their gazes darting like arrows. Alexandra walked with her chin high. Eliza, carrying the hymnals as part of her duty, trailed behind. The sermon had barely begun when whispers spread audibly. That's her, the maid, the one who played like a lady. Children craned their necks. Men smirked. Women whispered behind gloves. When the choir began a hymn, Alexandra saw it. The old organist had broken a finger, and his playing faltered. The sound wavered, threatening collapse. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, and then, unthinkably, someone thrust a violin into Eliza's hands. A villager, smirking, clearly mocking. Go on, girl. Play us a hymn since you fancy yourself musician enough. Laughter rippled. Eliza froze, trembling, cheeks burning with shame. She tried to hand the instrument back, but whispers hissed, "She can't. She's a fraud." Alexandra's pulse thundered. Every instinct screamed to stop it, to shield Eliza from their cruelty. But before she could rise, Eliza lifted the bow. The first notes shook, thin with fear. Laughter grew. But then, as though some unseen strength entered her, the melody steadied. The hymn unfolded, pure and luminous, filling the wooden beams of the church. The congregation fell silent, stunned. Even the choir paused to listen. By the final verse, voices joined again, but softer, led by the Maid no one wanted to acknowledge. When the hymn ended, the silence was thick. Eliza lowered the violin, eyes shining with unshed tears. And then Harrington's voice sliced through. "Blasphemy." The word cracked the spell. Murmurs flared again. Margaret dragged Alexandra up by the arm. "Do you see? She is a danger. She doesn't belong here." Alexandra shook her free. "She belongs wherever music does." That evening the trustees returned, this time with papers, dismissal papers. "We cannot allow her to remain," Harrington said. "Sign this, and she will be gone by morning." Alexandra stared at the paper as though it were poison. Her father's portrait loomed over her shoulder, silent but present. She heard his voice in memory. "Music belongs to anyone willing to listen hard enough." She pushed the paper away. "I will not sign." Margaret cried out. "You'll destroy everything for a servant." "For the truth," Alexandra corrected. "If the price of this house is her silence, then I would rather live in ruin than in lies." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave us no choice." Later that night, Eliza stood in the kitchen, hands trembling over the violin. She looked up as Alexandra entered, eyes filled with fear. "They'll force me out," Eliza whispered. "Not while I draw breath," Alexandra said. "But they'll come for me anyway. They'll erase me." Alexandra placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. "Then let the world try. You exist, Eliza, and as long as you play, they can never erase you." Eliza swallowed hard, clutching the violin like it was life itself. And though shadows gathered around them, the notes she drew next rose like defiance, trembling but unbroken, proof that sometimes existence itself was rebellion. They said she was a maid with stolen notes. Then she drew the music, and no one could deny what they saw. The storm around Eliza only grew louder. After the church humiliation, the trustees spread word in town that the Langford heiress had lost control, clinging to a servant girl's tricks. Handbills mocked them both. At markets, people whispered and pointed. Even the staff at the estate grew colder, resentful that a maid's name was on every tongue. But Alexandra did not bend. Each evening she returned to the kitchen and demanded that Eliza play. "If they call it scandal, let it be scandal," she said. "I'd rather drown in music than choke on silence." Eliza obeyed, though her hands trembled more each night. Shame and fear pressed down on her, but the violin always answered her trembling with steadiness. Until one night, something shifted. Eliza had just finished a Mozart sonata when Alexandra noticed the scraps of paper scattered across the counter. Crude sketches, lines, curves, circles, scribbled in pencil. "What's this?" Alexandra asked. Eliza flushed. "Nothing, just the way I see it." "The way you see what?" "The music." She hesitated, then picked up one page. On it, she had drawn not notes, but a series of spirals, each line thickening where the melody rose, thinning where it fell. Another page showed intersecting circles, each labeled faintly with letters C, G, A, linked by arcs like bridges. "It helps me remember," Eliza whispered. "When I hear a piece, I see shapes, patterns. They move in my head until I put them down. Then I can play them again." Alexandra studied the sketches, astonished. "You mean you've never read sheet music?" Eliza shook her head. "I never learned. This is how I keep it. This is my music." The next evening, Alexandra brought the sketches into her father's old study. She laid them beside the worn scores still shelved there. She compared a Mozart manuscript to Eliza's spirals. To her shock, the rise and fall matched, the swell of one line corresponding to a bold arc on Eliza's page. It was not nonsense. It was a language. She brought in Dr. Whitmore, an aging family friend who had once studied music theory. Reluctantly, he examined the drawings. His eyes widened. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "She's reinvented notation. Not as symbols on a staff, but as geometry. Anyone could follow this without training. Do you realize what this means?" "I do," Alexandra said quietly. "It means they can't erase her." But word traveled faster than Alexandra hoped. A week later, Harrington himself appeared at the estate with another trustee. He carried one of Eliza's diagrams, stolen from the servants' hall where someone had found it discarded. He slammed it onto the table before Alexandra. "Explain this." She kept her face calm. "It's hers. Eliza's." Harrington's voice dripped venom. "So it's true. She doesn't just play. She presumes to write. And worse, to rewrite music itself." "She has every right," Alexandra began. "No," Harrington thundered. "This is forgery. Blasphemy against art. If you let this spread, you'll not only disgrace your house, you'll endanger the very institutions that preserve culture. Music is for the trained, the refined, the born, not for a maid with a pencil and delusions." He ripped the paper in two. Eliza gasped, rushing forward, but Alexandra seized her arm before she could snatch the pieces. "Stop," she whispered. Harrington sneered. "Erase her, Alexandra, while you still can." And he stormed out, leaving scraps of Eliza's genius scattered like fallen leaves. That night, Eliza sat in the kitchen with tears staining her cheeks. "He's right," she whispered. "I shouldn't have drawn them." "It was foolish." Alexandra knelt beside her. "No, what you drew was truth, and truth frightens men like Harrington more than lies ever could." She gathered the torn pieces, laying them gently on the table. "Draw it again. All of it. Don't let him take it." Eliza hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked up her pencil. Slowly, lines began to appear again. Circles, spirals, arcs. A silent defiance traced in graphite. By dawn, a new diagram covered the page. It was larger, clearer, more alive than before. Alexandra looked at it and felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just notation. It was something greater. A map of sound itself. A way of seeing music as structure and space. It was, she realized, the beginning of a revolution. The following week, another gathering was held at the estate, this time a private one. Alexandra invited Dr. Whitmore and two other trusted musicians. Behind closed doors, Eliza played while her diagrams lay open on the table. The men followed the shapes with their eyes, stunned as each curve matched the rising phrases, each circle the shifting harmonies. One whispered, "This could change how we teach music." Another said, "If the world knew, she would be celebrated." But Dr. Whitmore's gaze was somber. "Or destroyed," because if the wrong men hold this first, they will not let her name remain." Alexandra felt the truth of it settle cold in her bones. That night, when the house slept, Alexandra returned to the study. Eliza's diagram lay before her, glowing faintly in lamplight. She touched the pencil lines with her fingertips. For the first time since her father's death, she felt not only grief but possibility. "They'll try to erase you," she whispered to the sleeping house. "But not while I live. This diagram changes everything, and it bears your hand, Eliza. The world will know." Her father's portrait watched silently above, violin in hand, as if blessing what had begun. Her name was never supposed to appear on paper, and when it did, the first hand that touched it tried to strike it out. The musicians who had seen Eliza's diagrams left the estate with wide eyes and hushed voices. Alexandra could tell from their reverence that they understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. But awe was a dangerous thing. Awe, when mixed with fear, often curdled into betrayal. 2 weeks later, the betrayal arrived. Alexandra sat at her father's desk when the envelope was delivered. Thick parchment stamped with the crest of the conservatory board. She slid it open and read, "A new theoretical paper has been submitted, proposing a geometric method of music notation. The author, Dr. Nathaniel Harrington." Her breath caught. The words, the diagrams. She recognized them instantly. They were Eliza's. The circles, the spirals, the bridges of sound, copied, polished, stripped of her name. The report had been sent to the board as if Harrington himself had conceived it. And in the covering letter he wrote, "This system has the potential to reshape pedagogy. I offer it in honor of the late Edmund Langford, who first inspired my thought." Alexandra's hands shook with fury. "He's stolen it," she whispered. "He's taken her gift, her truth, and clothed it in his name." Eliza discovered the theft that evening. Alexandra laid the letter before her on the kitchen table. Eliza's eyes scanned the diagrams, her lips parted, color draining from her face. "These are mine." "Yes." Her voice broke. "He's taken them, and now no one will believe they came from me." Alexandra knelt beside her. "Listen to me. They will erase you if we let them. But we won't. I swear it." Eliza pressed her palms over her face, tears spilling between her fingers. "I shouldn't have drawn them. I should have kept it all in my head." "No," Alexandra said fiercely, pulling her hands down. "You should have drawn them, and you will keep drawing them, because if we hide, Harrington wins, and I will not let that man write you out of existence." The days that followed turned into a battle fought with whispers. Harrington's paper began to circulate among trustees and scholars in the city. Some praised it as genius, others expressed skepticism, but nowhere was Eliza's name. When Alexandra protested, Margaret nearly fainted from outrage. "You would risk your reputation over this? For a servant girl's scribbles? Harrington has the ear of the conservatory board. He is respected. And you—" "I am Edmund Langford's daughter," Alexandra snapped, "and I know theft when I see it." "Be careful," Margaret warned darkly. "If you defy him publicly, you'll lose everything." Alexandra's voice trembled but held steady. "Then let it be lost." One evening, Alexandra invited Dr. Whitmore back to the estate. She placed Eliza's original sketches before him, alongside Harrington's polished copy. Whitmore's face tightened. "There is no doubt. He's taken her work. But you must understand, Miss Langford, if you confront him, they'll turn it against you. They'll say you've been deceived by a servant, that you're blinded by sentiment." Alexandra's eyes flashed. "Then let them. The truth does not bend to their convenience." Eliza sat quietly through the exchange, her hands twisting in her lap. When Whitmore had gone, she whispered, "Maybe I should just let it go. If I fight, I'll be crushed. If I stay silent, at least you won't suffer." Alexandra turned to her with fire in her voice. "Eliza, listen to me. They've already tried to erase you. If you surrender now, you erase yourself, and that would be the true tragedy." The confrontation came sooner than expected. At the next trustee meeting, Alexandra entered the hall with Eliza at her side. Gasps rippled through the chamber. No servant had ever stood in that room. Harrington's face darkened like a storm. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Alexandra held up Eliza's diagrams. "These belong to her. You know it. You took them and put your name where hers should be." The trustees muttered. Harrington laughed, low and cold. "Absurd. A maid drawing geometry? You insult this board with fairy tales?" "She doesn't need your belief," Alexandra shot back. "She can prove it." She laid fresh paper on the table. A pencil. She turned to Eliza. "Show them." Eliza's hands shook as she sat, the eyes of powerful men heavy upon her. For a moment, fear nearly silenced her. But then she heard Alexandra's whisper, "You exist, Eliza." Her hand steadied. Line by line she drew. Circles, arcs, spirals. A melody took shape before their eyes. Alive, precise, undeniable. When she finished, silence filled the room. Even Harrington could not disguise his shock. But he recovered quickly, sneering. "A parlor trick. She memorized these from my paper." "No," Alexandra said coldly. "Your paper memorized her." She gathered the diagrams, tucking them firmly under her arm. "Erase her if you dare, but you cannot erase what is true." She swept from the chamber with Eliza beside her, leaving the trustees in stunned silence. That night, in the quiet of the kitchen, Eliza collapsed into a chair, shaking. "I thought I would faint." Alexandra laid a hand on her shoulder. "But you didn't. You drew, and they saw." "They can't unsee it now." Eliza looked up, eyes wide with both fear and wonder. "What happens next?" Alexandra's gaze hardened. "Next, we fight harder, because if Harrington cannot erase you quietly, he will try to destroy you loudly." And both of them knew the true battle had only begun. It began with a rumor. A new article was about to appear in the Conservatory Journal, the most prestigious publication in the region. Its subject, a revolutionary system of geometric music notation. The author, Dr. Nathaniel Harrington. The moment Alexandra heard, she knew what it meant. If the paper was printed, if Harrington's name was bound forever in ink, Eliza would vanish. History would remember the theft, not the truth. 2 days later, a draft copy arrived by courier, slipped to Alexandra by a sympathetic clerk at the Journal. She opened it with trembling fingers. There it was, Harrington's diagrams, polished and redrawn, each arc and spiral stolen from Eliza's hands. The preface praised a new method born of disciplined study and refined intellect. At the bottom of the first page, Alexandra's eyes caught something faint, a tiny erased line in the margin. It read, E.L., Eliza's initials. She had signed her sketches once, long ago, in faint pencil. Harrington had copied them so faithfully he had nearly carried her name into print, and then, deliberately, carefully, he had erased it. Alexandra's fury burned white-hot. "They tried to remove your name," she told Eliza that night, laying the draft before her. "And they almost failed. But now they will pretend you never existed." Eliza stared at the erased initials, tears shimmering. They'll succeed, won't they? Who will believe me against him? I will, Alexandra said fiercely. And I will make them. The next trustee gathering was more hostile than ever. Alexandra stormed in with the draft in hand, Eliza trailing reluctantly behind her. You've gone too far, Harrington, Alexandra said, slamming the paper onto the table. You've erased her name, her life, and claimed it as your own. Harrington smirked. Evidence, Miss Langford? What you have is hearsay, scribbles on paper, the ramblings of a maid. This, he tapped the journal draft, is scholarship, recognized, respected, and soon published. Eliza's voice, small but trembling with anger, broke the silence. You copied everything, even my mistakes. That arc, she pointed to a diagram. I drew it wrong the first time, then corrected it. You copied the flaw. You didn't even understand it enough to change. The room stilled. Some trustees exchanged uneasy glances. Harrington's face flushed. A trick, he spat. She saw my paper and mimicked it. No, Alexandra said coldly. Your paper mimicked her. She lifted the draft so all could see the faint EL at the margin. You left her initials. You tried to erase them. But you failed. Murmurs spread through the room, but Harrington only sneered. Do you think one faint mark will outweigh my name? I am a scholar. She is nothing. History will choose the version it prefers. And with a gesture, he summoned a clerk to collect the papers. That night, Alexandra found Eliza in the kitchen, hunched over the violin as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. They'll never let me be more than a maid, Eliza whispered. Even if the world heard me play. Even if they saw me draw, they'd still say it wasn't mine, because I'm not supposed to exist. Alexandra sat across from her, voice steady though her heart ached. Then we'll give them no choice. If they try to erase your name, we will write it ourselves, so boldly they cannot blot it out. Eliza looked up, eyes red but fierce. How? Alexandra reached across the table, gripping her hand. By showing the world what only you can do. Not in stolen drafts, not in back rooms, but in the open. Play, draw, let them witness the truth with their own eyes. Eliza's breath caught. They'll laugh. They'll call it a trick again. Then let them laugh, Alexandra said, and let the music silence them. Days later, a public exhibition was announced at the conservatory. Harrington would unveil his theory before scholars, musicians, and patrons. Margaret begged Alexandra not to attend. You'll humiliate yourself, Alexandra. You'll ruin the family name entirely. But Alexandra only replied, The family name means nothing if it rests on a lie. She turned to Eliza. Will you stand with me? Eliza hesitated, trembling, but then she lifted the violin case. I will. The day of the exhibition, the hall was packed. Harrington stood at the podium, pages spread before him, diagrams displayed on easels. He spoke with authority, claiming brilliance, speaking of discipline, intellect, heritage. The audience nodded, impressed, until a voice rang out. Those are not your diagrams. Gasps rippled as Alexandra rose, Eliza at her side. Harrington stiffened. Miss Langford, this is not the time. It is exactly the time, Alexandra cut in. She gestured to Eliza. Show them. Eliza stepped forward, her hands shaking but her eyes burning. She set her own fresh pages on the table, new diagrams, drawn the night before. Spirals, arcs, lines alive with the melody she had written herself. Then she lifted the violin. The bow touched string. Music filled the hall, alive, undeniable. As she played, her hand traced the diagrams, showing how each shape matched the rise and fall, the breath and release. The audience leaned forward, astonished. This, Alexandra declared, is her language. Not yours. You tried to erase her name, Harrington, but you cannot erase the truth standing before you. The hall erupted, some in applause, some in outrage. Harrington shouted above the noise, calling it fraud, spectacle, madness. But the seed was planted. Dozens had seen, dozens had heard, and whispers had already begun to turn. That night, back at the estate, Eliza collapsed into a chair, tears streaming freely. "I thought I would faint," she admitted. Alexandra knelt beside her, steadying her trembling hands. "You didn't. You played. You drew. You proved yourself in the one place they couldn't ignore." Eliza's eyes shone, fierce through the tears. "Do you think it's enough?" Alexandra looked toward her father's portrait, silent but watchful. Then she answered softly, "It's the beginning. They tried to remove your name, but tonight you wrote it where no one can deny it." And though they both knew the battle was not over, something had changed. Eliza's existence had been witnessed, and that truth, once seen, could never be unseen. Dr. Whitmore said it without drama, but the words rang like a struck bell in Alexandra's chest. He stood in the doorway of her father's study, hat in his hands, winter light making a silver rim around his shoulders. "The Conservatory Journal meets at noon," he went on. "If no counter-evidence is filed, Harrington's paper goes to press. Once it prints, history will harden around his name." Alexandra glanced at the table. Spread across it lay Eliza's diagrams, spirals darkened where the phrase swelled, pale where it thinned, arcs bridging tonic to dominant, a river of pencil lines that caught a melody's shape as if it were visible air. Beside them rested the battered violin case that had started everything, and by the window stood Eliza herself, hands folded to hide their trembling. "What would count as counter-evidence?" Alexandra asked. "More than accusation," Whitmore said gently. "Dates, witness testimony, the live act of mind. They must see her think, not only hear her play." "Then they will," Alexandra said. She turned to Eliza. "Can you draw and play in the same breath?" Eliza's voice was small but steady. "If I must." Whitmore nodded. "One more thing. Bring the instrument. It matters that it is the same." Alexandra looked at the violin case, the cracked leather, the dulled latches, the handle that had outlived 100 hands. She lifted it and felt, as she always did, the weight of her father's absence wrapped in cedar and dust. "Before we go," she said, an impulse moving through her like the first step into cold water, "we stopped by Mr. Bellamy's." "The luthier?" Whitmore frowned. "There's no time." "There is," Alexandra said. "There must be." They went. Bellamy's shop smelled of rosin and oiled wood, of strings and years. The luthier was a thin man with a careful mouth. He had repaired Alexandra's childhood aches in this same room, replacing bridges she had snapped with overzealous practice. He took the case from her hands without question and opened it with something like a bow. "Edmonds," he murmured, the way a person says a name at a graveside. "I have missed this old friend." He lifted the violin to the light, turned it minutely, listened with his fingertips. "Can you make certain it is sound?" Alexandra asked. "We may need to play for wolves." Bellamy smiled with one corner of his mouth and set to work. He loosened strings, sighted the bridge, nudged a post, blinked at a hairline crack and hummed through his nose. When he lifted the chin rest, something resisted, stuck beneath the cork foot, as if time itself had placed a hand there. "What is that?" Alexandra asked. "A nuisance," he said, and with a thin blade coaxed it free. It was a folded slip of paper, browned and nearly transparent where oil and sweat had touched it. Bellamy hesitated, then offered it to her. Alexandra unfolded it in the lamplight. And her father's hand leapt up from the years, those precise, familiar letters that could never entirely decide between scholar and artist. If this instrument ever falls silent in our house, it must go where sound is honest. Lex, remember, music belongs to anyone who listens hard enough. If you find this in hands that play by ear alone, do not take it from them. Put our name beside theirs and let the house learn to listen. E.L. The room did not move. The dust in the light hung motionless, each mote a tiny witness. "Eliza," Alexandra whispered. Eliza's eyes were wide, wet. She reached as if to touch the paper, then withdrew, as if it were flame, and she had not yet decided whether to burn. Bellamy cleared his throat softly. "Forgive an old man," he said, "but a violin knows when it is wanted. This one has been waiting." Alexandra refolded the note with hands that did not feel like hers. She slid it into her pocket as one would pocket a blessing. "Thank you," she said to Bellamy. "Is it ready?" "It is itself again," he answered, fastening the chin rest. "Go!" They went. The conservatory's hall was a long, bright box with a high ceiling and the hum of gathered judgment. Trustees in winter wool, professors with starched collars, patrons with faces like polished stones. Harrington stood at the front already, flanked by 2 colleagues and a table dressed in fresh linen, his diagrams mounted on easels like trophies. Alexandra and Eliza entered together. A hush fell that was not respect so much as appetite. "You are late," Harrington said. "We are in time," Alexandra replied. The board chair, a tired man whose strength had long ago been hired out to the highest bidder, lifted a hand. "You have asked to submit opposition, Miss Langford. Be brief." Alexandra placed a stack of papers on the table, the kitchen pages still dusted faintly with flour and rosin. Dates scrawled at the top in the same hand that had scrubbed pans. Witnesses' statements from Mrs. Hargreaves and the night porter who had heard, unwillingly at first and then with a kind of shamefaced gratitude, the sound of Mozart returning to a quiet room. On the uppermost sheet, in the margin like a shy child at the door, the faint pencil initials, E.L., still visible where Harrington's eraser had failed to carry out the final execution. "Evidence," Alexandra said simply. Harrington smiled like a man smelling blood that will not be his. "Scribbles," he said. "Memory. Sentiment. The board cannot publish sentiment." "The board can publish truth," Dr. Whitmore said from the second row, and more than one head turned toward him. "If it chooses." "Truth is not a performance," Harrington snapped. "No," Alexandra said, "but sometimes it must be performed in order to be believed." She set a clean sheet before Eliza, set the violin on its back beside it. The room watched the 2 instruments, paper and wood, the way one watches a match held near a wick. "Eliza," Alexandra said quietly, "draw what you hear." Eliza did not look up. She lifted the pencil. Her hand was still at first. Then it moved, a small circle taking breath, an arc unspooling along a line only she could see. She hummed under it, too low for anyone but the front row to hear. The board chair leaned forward despite himself. Eliza's pencil darkened where the phrase surged, lifted where it released. Her other hand reached for the violin as if hands could be twins. She raised it, chin to wood, and the bow found the string in the space between shapes. Sound bloomed. It matched the curve as a river matches a bank. She drew and played and drew, pencil and bow arguing and agreeing in a language that made everyone in the room a child again, new to listening. The melody turned, and her line turned with it. The cadence settled, and her spiral tightened until it was a small, bright core on the page, like a star remembering itself. When she ended, no one clapped. It would have been profane. The board chair's mouth had fallen open a little, like a man who has been offered an answer to a question he had not yet admitted he was asking. Harrington found his voice first. "A parlor trick," he said, but his voice had to work to pass the word through the room. "She rehearsed this. She saw my diagrams." "Yours?" Alexandra lifted the draft he had sent to the journal. "You copied her arcs so faithfully you brought her initials with you. You tried to erase them. Some ghosts stay." A ripple ran across the room, the sound of people deciding how they would remember this day. The chair lifted a hand. "Dr. Harrington," he said slowly, "did you ever see these original pages before drafting your submission?" "I saw nothing," Harrington said. "This is a conspiracy mounted by a grieving heiress and her pet servant." "You saw them," said a quiet voice near the door. It was the clerk from the journal, a young woman with ink on her fingertips. She held up a ledger. "You delivered a first version of your paper 3 weeks ago. It had smudges on the edges that I noted because my sleeve picked up graphite. The smudges matched these pages, and the initials. I thought they were yours until I compared hands." Harrington turned on her. "You have no standing here." "She has a spine," Whitmore said mildly. "That will do." The chair exhaled, long and thin, like a reed letting go of air. "We will vote," he said. And for a moment it was possible to believe that the vote might not already be written in the invisible ink of habit. They did not leave the room. They leaned together, whispered, avoided certain eyes. Harrington stared straight ahead, face composed into the mask of a man who has fallen from a height and is still deciding whether to scream. The chair turned back at last. "The board suspends publication," he said. "An investigation will proceed into authorship. In the interim, the method will not be printed under any name." A sound moved through the hall, a mixture of relief and disappointment, of victory that does not yet dare to celebrate. Harrington's mouth twitched. "And," the chair added, surprising even himself with the additional word, "we invite Miss—" He looked at Alexandra helplessly. "Eliza," Alexandra said. "Eliza to present her work to a committee of pedagogy and performance. If her diagrams hold in the hands of others, and if testimony continues to support their origin, we will print them under her name." Under her name. It was not a coronation. It was not protection. But it was a door with the lock turned from the inside. Harrington's voice returned, colder now. A blade that had learned it could not cut the world and had decided to cut a throat instead. "This is not over." "No," Alexandra said, "it is not." And with her hand she passed the violin to Eliza, not as one passes a tool to a worker, but as one passes a candle in a church. The next weeks did not float. They trudged. Letters were written and answered, witnesses called. The kitchen pages were photographed and sealed. Other musicians were given Eliza's diagrams and asked to learn, and then asked to teach, and then asked to set aside staff and clef and see if the spirals would carry them without drowning. Some failed. Some did not. Each failure and each success added weight to her name. Aunt Margaret, who had once scolded with the certainty of a road sign, softened in increments. One afternoon she brought tea to the kitchen and set it down as if laying flowers at a grave. "I told myself this house was about keeping what we had," she said, not looking up from the steam. "I did not realize it could also be about learning something new. Your father would have loved this nuisance." Eliza smiled with that hesitant air she had never quite shaken, as if joy might still be snatched back. "Thank you, ma'am." "Do not ma'am me," Margaret muttered. Then, almost shy, "Play something." Eliza did, and Margaret cried without telling anyone she had. The clerk from the journal sent word that an editor had quit rather than shepherd a theft. Whitmore wrote a letter whose sentences did not raise their voice and therefore could not be ignored. Bellamy came by the estate and tightened a peg and told the kitchen that some rooms sound better when swept. Even Mrs. Hargreaves admitted between biscuits that flour falls more happily in a house that hums. Alexandra, who had spent 3 years building a fortress from quiet and paper, found herself busy with names. She met with 2 teachers from the city who believed more children would learn if they could see music before they read it. She looked at an unused wing of the house and did not see an emptiness to be guarded but a space to be filled. The letter came on a morning bright enough to be arrogant. The Conservatory Journal affirms the authorship of the geometric notation to Eliza, no surname supplied, and retracts all claims previously attributed to Dr. Nathaniel Harrington. A formal apology is enclosed. The board invites Eliza to publish a foundational article under her name and to demonstrate the method publicly in our spring series. There was also a second sheet, half torn, with words that had been written in a hand trying not to shake. I erred. The work was not mine. Forgive me this line, if nothing else. I was afraid of losing the place the world had kept for me, of learning to listen where I had only been heard. It was not absolution. It was not the law. It was a sentence from a man who had built his life on sentences that had never once had to apologize. Alexandra folded it with care and placed it in a drawer that held other unlikely things: a copper button from her father's rehearsal coat, a pressed clover, a place card with a wine stain that looked like punctuation. "Under your name," she said to Eliza, and the words went through her like bread. Eliza did not dance. She sat down as if the news had weight and placed her hands flat on the table so they would not float away. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Alexandra said, "we make it ordinary." They opened the old east wing and washed the windows until the light admitted it lived there. They brought in long tables and cheap chairs and slate with chalk fat enough for small hands. They hung no portraits. They asked no one for papers. The sign above the door read simply, "The House of Listening." On the first day, 3 children came: a girl with braids and a boy with a birthmark like a quarter moon, and a baker's son who carried a loaf of bread because his mother thought he ought to bring something if he were to take anything at all. Eliza spread paper before them and drew a slow circle. "This is how a note begins," she said. "You do not need to name it yet. You need to hear it." They drew circles. They hummed. One giggled and then did not when the circle on the page matched the circle in the mouth. In a week, there were 10. In a month, there were 20. Some from town, some from the servants' corridor, 2 from houses with steps the Langfords had once climbed instead of the other way around. No one asked who anyone's father was. They asked instead, "Do you hear this turn? Will you draw it?" Whitmore came on Tuesdays and pretended to be puzzled by his own fingers so the children could teach him the trick they had just learned. Bellamy stopped by and set a small open violin on the table and let little hands touch the raw ribs so they would know what sound is built upon. Aunt Margaret brought fruit and never once corrected a child's voice. Mrs. Hargreaves sent biscuits that arrived broken and were eaten entirely. On a late winter afternoon, Alexandra took the violin from its case and the folded note from her pocket. She brought both to the center of the room where Eliza stood with chalk on her knuckle from drawing crescents for a shy boy who would not yet sing. "Eliza," Alexandra said softly. Eliza turned. The children looked up, their attention bright as birds. "This is yours," Alexandra said, and she held out the violin. Eliza did not reach for it at first. "I cannot take your father's instrument. My father wrote that it must go where sound is honest," Alexandra said, and she placed the note in Eliza's open palm. Eliza read. She bit her lip once, a small, self-forbidden thing, and then she nodded without lifting her eyes. When she looked up, there were tears and something steadier than tears beneath them. I will keep it honest, she said. I know, Alexandra answered. She did not say the other thing out loud, that in this giving she felt, for the first time since Edmund's last breath, the exact shape of coming home. Play the second phrase, she whispered. Eliza lifted the violin. The children quieted as animals do when weather changes. The bow found the string. The room, which had been many rooms over its long life, nursery, storage, silence, became what it had been waiting to be. The phrase rose and turned. It found that small, bright core again and held it without fear. Alexandra stood with her hand on the doorframe. She did not hide her tears. She did not apologize for them. She let them write what they meant to write on her face. When the note fell away, one of the children, the boy with the quarter moon, raised his hand. Can I try? He asked. Yes, Eliza said, and she put the violin in his hands as if putting a map into a traveler's pocket. They printed the paper in the spring. It carried a simple title and a name that had never been meant to make it into ink. Listening Diagrams, A Geometric Approach to Memory and Performance. By Eliza. There was no surname. The journal did not insist. It turned out the world could learn a name one word at a time. Harrington resigned. The announcement was small. The conversations it ended were not. He moved away to a school that wanted his first half more than his second, and the city stopped letting its wine be poured by hands that could not bear to learn why it stained. In the Langford garden, crocuses stabbed at the cold ground and were not punished for it. The House of Listening opened its doors wider. Musicians from elsewhere came to see the spirals and left with pencil on their sleeves and a look like a hunger that had remembered its manners. On a Sunday, the house where no one had been allowed to speak above a certain volume for 3 years filled with people who had never had reason to be there, staff and townsfolk, patrons who had learned to take off their collars, children who had learned to draw circles first and names later. They stood in the kitchen and the east wing and in the hall under the portrait of Edmund Langford, whose painted eyes seemed amused by the company. Alexandra stepped to the center and did not hold a speech. She held a smaller thing, a sentence that knew it belonged where it stood. "This house used to teach me to keep," she said. "It is teaching me now to give. This is Eliza. She is not the maid who dared to play. She is the musician who taught our house to listen." Eliza raised the violin and did not bow before she did it. She only met the room as one meets a friend at a gate. She played the lullaby with no name, and the Mozart with the second phrase that felt like coming home and then something new she had written in the night, its spiral wide and generous as a road that does not end at a gate. When she finished, no one clapped at first. They breathed. Then, as if a tide had been called, the sound rose, hands and voices, and the noisy gratitude of people who have learned that the second phrase can be for them too. After, Alexandra stood beside the table and watched children trace circles on paper as if they were teaching the world to be round again. Aunt Margaret slipped a hand through Alexandra's arm and for once did not worry how it looked. "You have made a scandal into a school," she said. "We have made a room into a door," Alexandra replied. Eliza came toward them, the violin in the crook of her arm, the note folded and tucked into the case where it had slept for years and would not sleep again. "May I keep it open?" she asked, glancing toward the door of the east wing where light was making itself at home. "Forever," Alexandra said. They tried to remove her name. In the end, they learned to write it, not only in a journal, not only on a page, but in a room, on the air, in the listening of a house that would not forget again how to hear. And when someone asked years later how it began, the answer was always the same, with a maid in a kitchen, repairing a violin and playing by ear until an heiress walked in and instead of closing the case, opened the door. "Thank you for staying with us until the very last note." If this story found a quiet corner in your heart, that is the only applause we need. May we keep listening for the second phrase, the one that feels like coming home, wherever life takes us next.